panel or a couple of panels of experts from the United States to discuss the sorts of programs, cooperation programs that the United States is engaged in the area of chemical weapons, counterterrorism, and first responders and medical issues. But we also are interested in hearing your ideas on these subjects as we go forward. So this is hopefully will be an interactive discussion where our experts will talk a little bit about what we're doing, and we would be looking for input in terms of both what we're doing and what future priorities might be. So having said that, I'm also very delighted to welcome the Senior Director for Arms Control and Nonproliferation from the White House, Renee Avadi. He advises the President and the National Security Advisor on arms control and nonproliferation issues. He will open the session with a general view of U.S. policy toward arms control and in particular chemical weapons. And then we'll proceed to the panels on specific assistance programs. So with that, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Ambassador Manso, and to your delegation for the invitation to speak here. I just want to make sure up front that when Ambassador Manso refers to expert panelists, he's not referring to me. He is, in fact, referring to the panelists that will follow me. So what I will give you is a broader overview, and happy to answer any questions you have. I do want to thank you for your time and interest in this critical issue, as well as the OPCW's Technical Secretariat for their support. As Ambassador Manso mentioned, my portfolio covers arms control, disarmament, and nonproliferation at the National Security Council. And over the past couple of years, there's obviously been a lot to keep track of in that space, but I'm happy to be here as I'm especially mindful for how important a year it is for the Chemical Weapons Convention. As the United States continues our progress in destroying the last of our chemical weapons stockpile this year, we will have an opportunity to recommit ourselves to preventing the reemergence of chemical weapons, reinforcing norms against possession and use, including the threat of non-state actors from using chemical weapons. This is the type of work that cannot succeed without international cooperation. And it's a topic of frequent conversation in Washington as we consider how to enhance the value of our programs to build capacities related to deterring, detecting, responding to, and investigating chemical weapons use around the world. We consider these efforts to be a fundamental part of our obligation as a state party, and it's essential work for the OPCW. Between the inauguration of the Chemtech Center and the review conference this month, our community must meet the moment to advance these cooperative efforts and take a more expansive look at where our attention is most needed. Throughout today's workshop, I look forward to hearing your perspectives on this. My team feels a sense of responsibility to make sure that we're focusing on efficient and tailored programming with the goal of reaching more participants and states parties and ensuring that they have resources they need to fully implement the convention. Our conversation here is timely because the administration recently unveiled a new policy on countering weapons of mass destruction terrorism in the United States and overseas, which I'm proud to outline for you today. First, let me share the strategic context with which we approach this new policy. Right now, the most visible parts of the U.S. national security strategy are related to strategic competition. That's in part due to our collective success in reducing weapons of mass destruction terrorism, or the threats that can emanate from weapons of mass destruction terrorism, but we have not taken our attention off of what we consider to be a no-fail mission in the United States government. During the past 2 decades, the terrorist threat has evolved, becoming more ideologically diverse and more geographically diffuse. At the same time, technological hurdles in the weapons of mass destruction space do not seem as high as they once were. As a result, we're evolving our counterterrorism enterprise to ensure that it's well-positioned and nimble enough to meet emerging threats in real time. Our long record of success with preventing and preparing against WMD terrorism threats allows us to incorporate past lessons into our work today. It's a personal priority for President Biden who has been committed to this issue starting as a senator when he co-sponsored fundamental legislation on cooperative threat reduction, known to many of you as the Nunn-Lugar program. As vice president, he championed programs to bolster international norms around protecting weapons of mass destruction related materials and preventing attacks, including through the Nuclear Security Summit process. And as president, from the outset of this administration, President Biden directed the national security staff, including my team, to develop concrete plans to ensure that U.S. policies, programs, postures, and capabilities are sufficient to counter these evolving threats. In March, reflecting the culmination of 2 years of work, President Biden signed our new National Security Memorandum, also known as NSM-19, on countering WMD terrorism and advancing nuclear and radioactive material security. This new guidance from President Biden underscores his enduring commitment to the cooperation and assistance programs we're discussing today. It integrates U.S. responsibilities across the full federal enterprise to counter the use of chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons by non-state actors. It also affirms a U.S. commitment to work with state, local, tribal, international, and industry partners on ways to prevent, mitigate, and respond to WMD terrorism, no matter what form that threat may take. Domestically, this work will ensure that we, with our public and private sector partners, have a network of detection, protection, and response capabilities in place. International cooperation will continue to be vital. The new strategy emphasizes the critical role played by our global partners, buttressed by longstanding international disarmament and nonproliferation regimes like the CWC and other multilateral mechanisms to reach these objectives. In fact, our White House Homeland Security Advisor, Dr. Liz Sherwood-Randall, has championed this message as we've rolled out the new policy in Washington, and she specifically identified the OPCW as an important stakeholder in this mission. In the context of today's conversation, I'd like to focus on how we are working to prevent the use of chemical weapons by non-state actors. Our strategy is to address all stages of chemical terrorism, from acquisition through use, to ensure that the U.S. government is able to prevent, mitigate, and respond to these threats. These include enhancing chemical safety and security, detecting and disrupting chemical terrorism threats, degrading weapons of mass destruction related capabilities of non-state actors, including deterring and holding accountable those who provide material, financial, or other support to their efforts, and enhancing resilience and recovery from chemical attacks. As I mentioned before, the policy explicitly acknowledges that it will be necessary to involve the broadest range of partners, state, local, tribal, and territorial counterparts, private sector partners, and international partners in this work. It also directs U.S. government departments and agencies to enhance their capabilities to anticipate and manage emerging technology that could enable WMD terrorism threats. I'm glad to be joined by several interagency colleagues here who will share more details about how their work contributes to this overarching strategy. And you'll see how these lines of effort connect to our work here in The Hague. Before I conclude, I want to share how I see this fitting into the CWC context. I've mentioned how we're eager to celebrate the inauguration of the OPCW Center for Chemistry and Technology. As you all know, it's directly relevant to today's conversation because it will drive research, analysis, training, and capacity building to eliminate chemical weapons and promote peaceful uses of chemistry. The United States is proud to have contributed to its construction because strengthening our international frameworks and building partners' capacities are not only key tenets of our administration's work to counter chemical threats, but important to our overarching foreign policy objectives. We're also proud to have contributed to the OPCW's Africa program, which advances many of the principles we'll discuss today, like building customs and border controls, lab capabilities, national implementing legislation, and first responder training. And we support the initiatives of the open-ended working group on terrorism here at the OPCW. We've learned from experience that tabletop and field exercises can help us prioritize work on CW terrorism, to identify gaps in areas for further capacity building, and to spread best practices. Those are just a few highlights of the important work happening in multilateral settings that give us a model to follow going forward for our international chemical weapons engagement. In closing, the challenge of reducing and countering the threat of terrorist acquisition and potential use of a weapon of mass destruction, including chemical weapons, is one of the most enduring and important national security threats. It has been on our agenda for decades, and it will persist far into the future. I cannot overstate the importance of the collaborative partnerships we must build and sustain to achieve the goals that the President has set forth, including with those of you joining us today. I'm honored to be here today because I believe in these priorities, and I'm eager to hear what is in the front of your minds and what you consider to be your priorities in this mission. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ambassador Manso and welcome any questions or comments from our audience.
Well, thank you. The floor is open for questions or comments. If anybody would like to question one of our senior White House officials, this is your opportunity to do so. Yeah. Yes, our colleague from Guatemala.
Thank you. Is it now? Oh, okay. So let me break the ice with a question that I already put forward to you during the retreat for ambassadors last week. And perhaps your colleagues can expand on the recent efforts to strengthen supervision over the logistics chain, specifically maritime transportation. There's a lack of complete knowledge of what is happening within consolidated cargo, especially the containerized cargo. And I was wondering if there are any news from the U.S. authorities in this matter, specifically on the issue of proliferation. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a couple of questions. Romania, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Manso. Thank you for the panelists. I would like to raise an issue of general nature. We have recently had the opportunity to address it in our retreat, and I think we are very much interested in understanding the U.S. views on this. And the issue is about engaging the engaging the external actors, the external partners, and reaching out to the stakeholders coming from the industry, from the academia, from the civil society. Because on the one hand, we have a priority in creating a professional-based staff, professional core-based staff in the OPCW. On the other hand, we have the interest to attract as many as possible young people and professionals and members of the civil society for the activities of the technical secretariat, but also in support of the values that OPC stands for. So how does the administration look at the relationship between the OPCW and the external actors? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Manso, and thank you very much to the panelists for the very interesting presentation. My question concerns non-state actors, non-state parties. I was wondering if maybe you could elaborate a little bit what the strategy is towards achieving universalization of the convention. As you know, that's a key priority for many of us here in the OPCW. Thank you.
Thanks. So to our colleague from Guatemala, thank you for flagging that issue. I think I probably have to defer to the expert panel on that, but it's important that you flagged it for me, and I've taken note of it, but I don't have anything more I can say specifically on it. I'm sure my more expert colleagues will, though. On engaging external actors, stakeholders, I think that the OPCW is really a model for where these sort of formalized multilateral arms control institutions can really benefit from engagement with academia, with the technical community, and with industry. In part, that's because the CWC, as every country knows, is so it's so important to integrate it into domestic law and regulation that just the nature of the convention itself forces that external stakeholder action to happen. But also fundamentally, from a technical perspective, there's more ease of access from an academic standpoint to chemistry and that knowledge that doesn't exist in some of the other weapons of mass destruction topics. And so we think it's incredibly important. I think that we've highlighted in this administration the value of people-to-people exchanges across the board, not just in international institutions, but on a bilateral basis as well. So I think for the health of the OPCW and the health of the regime, it's important to continue to engage stakeholders, particularly those from countries that do not feature as prominently in international institutions devoted to arms control and nonproliferation, as well as younger actors who are coming up through academia who may have opportunities to contribute to this space in their professional careers. On universalization, I mean, obviously it's a key U.S. priority, and I think a priority for many states parties. I think our approach beyond obviously the public messaging and our diplomatic action is to continue to show up with these institutions in force, to continue to have senior level engagement on chemical weapons issues to demonstrate that it continues to be a U.S. priority. Our hope is that and I think the CWC really again is setting a high mark for how much closer it is to universalization than other treaties and conventions may be. It's important for us to continue to have momentum as an institution and to show that the work goes on regardless of the geopolitical environment, regardless of tension that exists among major states parties. And so part of this is really showing up for us and showing that the institution can work.
Okay, thank you. Is that Ghana that has a question? Okay, please go ahead.
Thanks for the presentation. I have some few comments or let's say remarks. During the opening remarks that's of the Mr. Prani, is that a correct name? if I pronounce it well. Well, you said the United States, as part of its policy, is equally interested in the policy relates also to strategic competition. My first question is if you can clarify a little bit what you mean when you said that the United States is committed as well, that the policy is also related to strategic competition. What exactly is the context of the strategic competition? If we are interested to rid our world of CWC, either by state actors or non-state actors. The next comments I would like to make is to welcome the U.S. government's initiatives towards global partnership, including with the OPCW, and I'm equally pleased to hear your commitment or the commitment of the U.S. government towards the promotion of peaceful use of chemistry, particularly in the developing countries like those in Africa. You mentioned as a policy thrust on chemical safety, security, the grading of the capacity of non-state actors through the broader framework with state parties, whilst enhancing resilience against chemical attacks should that occur. May I now, at that point, in that context, ask if you can break it down, specifically what the U.S. government, how is deploying that policy? Is it through bilateral framework? Is it through engaging organizations such as OPCW for it to see specifically some details of such initiatives? If you can enlighten us. Thank you.
Yes, Yemen, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Manso, and I wish to thank Mr. Vadi for the opening remarks. Actually, it's not a question, it's more remarks rather than a question. During the years of 2012 until 2015, we get a long-term project with the United States, the Chemical Safety and Security, and on a holistic approach and tailored made program. We have trained directly or indirectly around 600 people, either from governmental institutions, private sectors, small and medium traders, laboratories, and hospitals for chemical safety and security. And looking back to the capacity program we got with the United States, one of the outcomes or the impacts that we establish chemical safety and security points at the borders and points of entry to Yemen, which helped us actually to control and track the entire chemical items, and also to control the threats coming from the non-state actors. Nevertheless, according to our impact assessment, we get to realize that there are some missing points and forgotten Hamlet traps. We could have taken in board those efficient elements. One of the most important elements that we forgot or didn't get enough attention to is the to include the decision makers to our training courses, because it was highly important to include them, because they are the ones who approve budget and to have the final word for the chemical safety and security procedures. So I wish that this issue will be taken in the future for any potential future capacity development programs. Thank you.
No, thank you for your input. Any other thoughts, questions, or observations? And if not, Renee, over to you.
Well, to address some of the questions raised by my colleague from Ghana. Look, I think on your first question, the reason I raised strategic competition in the context of the national security strategy is the mere fact that much of the national security strategy, the language in it, the pages and the page count, are devoted to the idea of a long-term competition between the United States and China. It doesn't, of course, say that there are no opportunities for cooperation, but merely states the geopolitical fact that the United States and China are finding disagreements in the region. That's the only reference that I was making. And the reason I make that reference is to point to what is a national security memorandum, a presidential level policy that is purely devoted to combating weapons of mass destruction terrorism. And so the reason I raise that is to highlight for this group that our focus on countering chemical weapons terrorism is not going away just because a national security strategy is devoting more pages to strategic competition as a topic, whether it's with China and Russia. And so that means that we still have to continue to focus on these issues, and we will continue to focus on these issues. I think more broadly speaking, you've highlighted some really important areas of discussion for this group today. On cooperation and assistance broadly, I think we want to be receiving specific requests and ideas from this group. As a general matter, and leaning on weapons of mass destruction cooperation assistance programs like Nunn-Lugar and other programs that the U.S. has embarked on over the past couple of decades. We've always found that through cooperation, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, we together can identify gaps that need to be filled, whether they're legal and regulatory in nature in a country, related to capacity, related to funding, technical know-how, training, etc. We've seen this in border security assistance. We've seen this across the board. And I think an end goal that we don't always achieve, but we always hope for, is that the knowledge that is shared, the capacity that is built in a country that is receiving that assistance, is such that that country becomes so proficient that they're able to help other countries, right? So in the train the trainer model that our colleagues from the Defense Department like to use frequently, we hope to develop that expertise to such an extent that other countries not only are confident that they're able to grapple with the counter CW problem that they may have to deal with in their own borders, but they're actually able to export those best practices and offshore that expertise to other countries in the region. So we're kind of creating these sort of centers of excellence model, if you will, through our assistance and cooperation. And I think we've seen that model works in the U.S. government and our partnership with other countries, and that's true for this area as well.
Okay, any other thoughts or comments? And if not, I would suggest that we begin our first panel. We are fortunate in having a number of expert speakers. We have Mr. Konstantinos Nikolaidis, Deputy Director of the Office of Weapons of Mass Destruction Terrorism from the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation from the State Department. Audrey Spear, who deals with chemical security, cybersecurity, and infrastructure security at the Department of Homeland Security in Washington. And Dr. Irma Macalianeo, who is a professor and coordinator for CBRN Health Security at the University of the Philippines. And they will be discussing the broad topic of chemical security and emerging threats. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Konstantinos for you to start the panel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you here today. My name is Costa Nikolaidis, and I am, as the Ambassador mentioned, the Deputy Director of the Office of Weapons of Mass Destruction Terrorism in the Department of State's Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation. Our office, WMDT, was created in the aftermath of 9/11 specifically to focus on countering the ability of terrorists to obtain WMD, their precursors and components, and in fact, the knowledge required to build them. And our focus for many years was mainly on countering rad nuke threats. But over time, as those threats have evolved, so has our mission space. And we're now implementing threat-based programming across the CBRN spectrum, along with our other sister offices in our Bureau, ISN. Next slide, here we are. Okay, great. Now, I know everybody in this room is probably very familiar with the threat picture presented here, but I think it's worth reviewing how we in the United States see this threat picture, because that's really what drives decisions about how we utilize the funds that the Congress provides us for combating CW threats. The threat from non-state actors is a principal driver of these decisions. We know, for example, that terrorist groups remain interested in developing and using chemical weapons, that the small-scale use of toxic industrial chemicals and crude toxins pose unique challenges, namely due to their ready availability, and that the information required to both use those readily available chemicals and create weapons is also available on the internet and especially the dark web. And when we couple these facts with the ability of non-state actors to exploit ungoverned spaces as a base for their activities, it gives us great cause for concern, obviously. But while non-state actors take up a lot of our attention, sadly, we still find ourselves facing state-based threats. And there's probably no collection of people more acutely aware of this than those of you with responsibilities here at the OPCW. In recent years, we've all watched Russia's targeted and repeated use of sophisticated CW agents, not to mention its deeply troubling attacks on and near chemical facilities in Ukraine. We've seen the vertical proliferation by several states in violation of CWC. We've watched as states have exploited the free market and global supply chains to procure equipment, technology, and precursors for illicit CW programs. And of course, we've all been targets of an onslaught of disinformation campaigns designed to undermine accountability. So despite all of our accomplishments, of course, there remains much work to be done. Great. So in the face of these challenges, the United States has turned its energy towards building and sustaining partnerships with states interested in tackling these issues. And as you can see from this slide, in 2022, ISN, our bureau, partnered with over 60 countries and provided over $50 million in assistance to counter these threats. Now, those are easy figures to recite, but what does that actually mean? Oftentimes it is in training. Oftentimes this is a provision of equipment. It frequently involves regional exercises, and it's always aimed at preparing ourselves and our partners to prevent, detect, investigate and respond to threats posed by groups acquiring, trafficking, and using chemical weapons. So we work, for example, to enhance detection by providing technical support to help in the detection of those sophisticated chemical agents. We work to strengthen border security, and this can involve both physical border measures and the management of chemical imports and exports. And we work to share best practices, including implementation of inventory management, supply chain, know your customer, physical security, and stockpile neutralization best practices. So this is the work of many offices, both inside the State Department and in other agencies across the U.S. government. And we have a number of those representatives here who can speak to those efforts. So I'll focus today on the work that we do in the State Department inside the ISM Bureau. Slide, please. As you can see, our office, WMDT, is focused on countering threats from non-state actors, which we do by working with many partners to protect against emerging threats. And we do so in a way that supports the U.S. national security strategy's partner-led, U.S.-enabled counterterrorism focus. So that means that we work very closely with partners to define the programs that would assist them the most, and in a manner that, broadly speaking, advances global nonproliferation efforts and reinforces norms against WMD use. So some examples of work that we're doing in our office: countering chemical industry cyber risks. We help partners identify gaps that could lead to cyber threats. And we ask questions like, how can we make our systems more resilient? What can we do to secure our facilities and processes? And how can we implement countermeasures against those threats? And then we'll design a program with our partners that delivers the latest thinking from US experts and others on these topics to our partner states. In addition, we will provide training on crime scene management and forensic analysis of contaminated evidence and chemical agents to support prosecutions. And recently, we've been conducting a series of exercises related to identifying and investigating clandestine chemical and biological toxin laboratories. As we look to the future, our priorities include continuing that bilateral cooperation with partner states, expanding partnerships, particularly in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, implementing regional exercises for countries in North Africa and Latin America to share best practices, and supporting the international partnership against impunity for the use of chemical weapons. Just to give you a sense of the numbers, our office spent about $5 million on 19 engagements last year, and those were in Algeria, Morocco, Nigeria, Kenya, Senegal, Cameroon, South Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. So we've got quite a wide range of partners. Next slide, please. Our Office of Export Control Coordination manages the United States Export Control and Border Security Program, which helps partners identify and fill regulatory and institutional gaps in export control systems. Now, ECC does this in part by promoting effective controls on transfers of sensitive technologies and promoting enforcement, including proper targeting, inspection, interdiction, and investigation of violations at and in between ports of entry. So a typical XBIS program might identify protocols for interdiction of specific chemical agents at borders, then assist with procurement of equipment for implementing protocols, and then train partner states' border forces to utilize that equipment, both for interdictions and to support follow-on investigations. So a few examples of ongoing and planned work from ECC. From 2021 to 2023, XBIS is partnering with Iraq and Jordan on a joint project to improve regional explosive precursor security by developing tools and delivering training focused on effective management and tracking of chemical imports and exports. And from 2022 to 24, XBIS is collaborating with program Global Shield of the World Customs Organization to counter illicit trafficking and diversion of chemical precursors and other components used to manufacture improvised explosive devices. And from 23 to 24, the office will also be contributing to legal drafting and chemical security and chemicals management expertise to Vietnam's chemical agency as it seeks to harmonize its laws on chemicals with CWC guidelines and international best practices. So XBIS, or ECC, that office, but through the XBIS program, spent about $23 million in programming last year dedicated all or in part to countering CW threats. And it's worth saying all the offices I'm talking about here today really program across the CBRN spectrum, but obviously I'm focused specifically on the chemical portion here today. Next slide, please. ISN's Office of Cooperative Threat Reduction is one of our largest programs, and it's aimed at countering the activities of proliferator states, basically. CTR has a very wide remit and scope, but I thought I'd draw your attention to just a few of their ongoing lines of effort to highlight the distinction between their work and that of other offices. Among its other work, CTR has implemented programs designed to teach partners how to recognize signs and symptoms, respond to and treat casualties of chemical incidents and attacks, including Novichok use, to build interministerial and public-private coordination to prevent exploitation and diversion of weaponizable materials, and to promote coordination and strategic messaging plans to report on the potential use of CW agents in a hostile information environment. So last year, ISN CTR's chemical security program delivered approximately $7 million in capacity building assistance in more than 17 countries. Next slide, please. So this slide discusses the Office of Non-Proliferation and Disarmament.
Can you help me download this so that I can have it?
Excuse me, could one of our online participants please mute their mic? Thank you.
So as you can see from the top line statement here in the slide or point, NDF really operates almost as a contingency fund, which is to say that it's utilized to address urgent high priority gaps that can't be immediately addressed by other existing programs. So NDF, like other offices, conducts a lot of work across the entire CBRN spectrum. In the interest of time here, I know this is a busy slide. I've just highlighted a few of the CW focused projects they work on. For example, when we realized suppliers of rudimentary chemical precursors and specialized equipment that could be used as ID components lacked an understanding of their customer base, NDF developed training that allows these suppliers to conduct customer due diligence investigations. Similarly, NDF funding was utilized to map the global distribution network of key IED precursors and identify supply chain vulnerabilities for capacity building engagement, which in turn enabled us to more effectively target some of our programming. The office has also been instrumental in rapidly developing procedures to ensure the chain of custody for chemical attack samples, supporting international attribution and accountability efforts. And finally, just to give you a sense of the numbers, NDF spent, well, this is just a portion of it, NDF spent approximately $10 million in calendar year 22 to train and equip Ukrainian partners to effectively detect, prevent, and respond to chemical incidents, to conduct personal and mass decontamination, and collect environmental samples, preserve evidence, and ensure chain of custody in support of our attribution and accountability efforts. So how does this all come together? Next slide. So the U.S. remains, of course, committed to Article 10 of the CWC by providing financial and technical assistance that enables our partners to counter the CW threat. We obviously will continue to support the critical work being done here at the OPCW, and including by potentially holding future ISN-funded engagements that I've described, some of which I've described at the new Chemtech Center, which we had an opportunity to see yesterday, and provides some potential synergies that I think are good. Well, obviously, we'll continue to reinforce global norms against CW use, and we're going to use our diplomacy partnerships and programs in a coordinated manner to counter disinformation and hold those involved in the use of CW accountable. And the last point here is, I think, the most important. We're very interested in learning more about CWC states parties, other chemical security priorities, and how ISN programs can support them. In particular, if there is information or if there are gaps in capacities or over the horizon threats that you all see, would appreciate you raising those with our mission here at the OPCW. We want to partner with nations that are interested in tackling these challenges. I think we're going to save questions for later. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you for your time and turn this back over to Ambassador Manso. Thank you very much.
I believe I'm next on the agenda. While the slides are getting pulled up, I'll just like to introduce myself again. My name is Audrey Spear. I am a senior program specialist at the Office of Chemical Security inside the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We are one of the newer agencies in the Department of Homeland Security. So today I'm going to share with you some information about our ongoing chemical security initiatives and multilateral chemical security partnerships. Next slide, please. So, but before I get into those details, I'll give you a brief overview of my office. So our office's mission is to secure America's high-risk chemical facilities and to prevent the use of chemicals in a terrorist attack in the United States. We accomplish this mission by a mix of regulatory and voluntary programs. So our regulatory program is the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Regulation, and this is where we identify chemical facilities that are high risk and work with them to develop tailored security plans that meet risk-based standards. We've been implementing this program in the United States for 15 years. The voluntary program is we launched last year, so quite new for us, is ChemWalk, and this program offers no-cost services and tools to help facilities with dangerous chemicals understand their risk and help them improve their security posture. And I'll speak to our international initiatives here on the next slide, please. So the first initiative I'll speak about is the Global Congress on Chemical Security and Emerging Threats. So it started in 2018 and is jointly co-implemented by Interpol and 3 U.S. government agencies. So my office, the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, and then the U.S. Defense Threat Reduction Agency. The Global Congress is an international network of chemical security practitioners and experts who work together to counter the threat of chemical and explosive terrorism. We currently have around 400 delegates from over 70 countries that represent a variety of stakeholder groups, including law enforcement, government regulators and policymakers, industry, academia, scientific institutions, and international organizations. OPCW is a member of the Global Congress. The collaborative nature of this network drives discussion and joint activities across a range of different areas of expertise in chemical security and regional perspective. I'll also add that Global Affairs Canada is a supporter of the Global Congress as well. Next slide, please. So what are some of the activities in this network, in this community of practice? So we have currently have 6 activities, and I'll briefly go through them. So the first is our in-person meetings. We host annual plenary sessions of the Global Congress Network, and this is an opportunity for members to meet together in person in a closed, secure environment to share case studies, mitigation information, best practices on a range of chemical security threats and issues. Webinars is the second activity. So like most during the pandemic, we had to pivot away from our in-person meetings for a while, and we started using webinars and virtual engagements to engage the network and continue this chemical security dialogue during the last couple of years. We plan to continue these since they've been quite a valuable tool to share information with the network. So these webinars range from either panel topics or panels or special topic events, and they're open to network members. Interpretation is provided in all 4 Interpol languages. Some of the topics we've covered: chemical security in a pandemic, so panels on how to implement chemical security when you're operating at in a pandemic environment with less resources and less human security experts at your facility or at your institution, cybersecurity for chemical security. And then we're actually hosting a webinar tomorrow in which the Royal Gendarmerie of Morocco will be presenting on a case study of a terrorist manual found in a recent investigation that has a lot of recipes for explosive and toxic chemical recipes. The Global Knowledge Hub is the third circle there. So if you look online for the Global Congress on Chemical Security Emerging Threats, you won't find a lot of information. And that's because most of our information is stored on Interpol's secure website, the Global Knowledge Hub. Discussion boards, resource sharing, all happens on that Global Knowledge Hub. It is open to all network members. You just have to do some security trainings in order to get a username and access. I'll jump ahead to the sixth circle, which is the request for technical assistance. This is another activity mechanism in the Global Congress. This is a way for really peer-to-peer information sharing and technical expertise support. So any one of the network members can submit a request for technical assistance. The co-implementers, we receive that request and then look to pair that with a relevant subject matter expert. One of our success stories was we received a request from a university in Tunisia looking for mentorship on a chemical forensics abstract. We were able to connect them with a national lab, the United States, and understand that mentorship was quite fruitful. So that's just an example of request for technical assistance. This isn't unlike funding requests or PPE support. It's more for peer-to-peer information sharing. And then the other two activities I'll mention are really advisory bodies to the Global Congress co-implementers. So the first one is in the Industry Advisory Group, and then the second one is the Steering Committee. We stood up these advisory groups as we're quite aware that it's 3 U.S. agencies and Interpol who were setting the tone and dialogue for the Global Congress. We really wanted to make sure we were tapping all the different sectors in multiple countries in developing the programs, the webinars, the themes for the year. So those have been quite productive. Know several members in this room who have representation at those groups in various capacities, including the OPCW as well. And it's really helped our maturation when we host activities. Next slide, please. So wanted to, I've talked a lot about the type of activities, who we have engaged. So I wanted to provide you all a brief snapshot of some of the key themes and dialogue that's happening at these Global Congress plenary sessions. So provide the overview of the 2022 Global Congress plenary, which we held in October in Morocco. These meetings are closed, so we do publish outcome reports from these meetings, but they are quite sanitized to protect the ongoing investigations and information shared from partners during these conversations. So some of the key themes, as I mentioned, partnership, communication, collaboration, and coordination was talked about by nearly every member who presented during our 3-day plenary session. And there's still a lot of challenges and gaps in this chemical security area. Lots of challenges identified in how to practically implement chemical security. So not just policies and procedures, but how are you working together, working in your organizations across, law enforcement to government decision makers, et cetera. It was highlighted that there needs to be an exchange of communication both ways on suspicious activity reporting between industry and law enforcement, academia as well, and that there's really a range of sophistication in the world for detecting suspicious transactions. We only scratched the surface on e-commerce and online sales, chemical security in those areas. So information like how are you securing your chemicals before they're shipped online? How are you vetting the purchases? How are you detecting suspicious transactions? All part of the dialogues in October of last year. Also, a lot of discussions and questions on how to incentivize chemical security through regulatory and voluntary frameworks. And when we polled the audience, so we had about 222 members of the network join us in October, they said regulators and industry were the biggest gaps in their chemical security network. Next slide, please. So I'll preview some of the activities we have coming up for this year. So we have already a date set for our next plenary session in Bangkok, Thailand. And the focus of this plenary is going to be chemical security in action. And then we're looking at doing something new through the Global Congress, which is to develop resources to specifically address some of the gaps and issues that have been raised through the industry advisory group, through the steering committee, and the Global Congress dialogue. So the first is how to identify suspicious transactions or request from quotes fact sheet. I think you can tell the tie in there from the previous slide. Second is technical guidance for how to secure and neutralize chemicals during a crisis or emergency situation. And then the third is chemical security voluntary standards or recommendations from the facility security standpoint. Before we go to the next slide and the next initiative, I'll just say that this is a free network to join. It's no cost. We don't, no registration fees or membership dues. And we're really, as I said, through the advisory groups, we're really looking for network members to drive the dialogue and discussions. So, maybe part of the conversation today, I'm interested to hear from you all. What are some of those emerging threats and issues that you and your countries are facing? We are also looking to expand our geographic diversity and our stakeholder diversity. We have a lot of sectors represented, but we do know that some of those, such as the decision makers, policy makers, we can have better represented in the network and in our in-person meetings. So interested in you all, in your nominations for who you think would be a valuable member to this network as well. Next slide, please. So the second initiative I'll mention is the G7's a global partnership against the spread of weapons and materials of mass destruction. I'll say that we are a member of the global partnership. This year, Japan is the president of the G7 global partnership. So what is it? It is an initiative to prevent terrorists or states that support them from acquiring and developing weapons of mass destruction. The G7 GP supports and coordinates projects and activities in and not just the chem space, but also biological, nuclear, and radiological security. There are 31 member states plus international organizations who participate in the global partnership, one of those being the OPCW. There is a chemical security sub-working group for the global partnership. And that working group focuses specifically on efforts to counter the spread and use of chemical weapon-related chemicals and precursors, and supports initiatives that promote chemical security across industry and relevant communities. One of the aspects of the global partnership that not just cross the chemical security working group, but all of the working groups, is matchmaking. And this is an opportunity for member states or external partners to submit threat reduction proposals for global partnership members, potential donor funding, and or expertise. Say for this year, as I mentioned, Japan is the GP president, and the United States and Japan co-chair the Chemical Security Working Group. Next slide. And then the last initiative I'll speak to is the Chemical Security Framework Project. This is actually not a CISA project either, but it's one that our office has contributed to. It is a Defense Threat Reduction Agency project and was developed by Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. The implementation of the project will be covered by my colleague, Dr. Irma, in her presentation, but also I'll just give a quick high-level overview of the project. So the goal for this project was to develop recommendations on how to establish national chemical security regimes through consolidated legislative and regulatory approaches and specific measures for countries to consider to reduce the risk of illicit chemical weapon acquisition and use and high consequence acts involving chemicals. How did they go about developing these recommendations? Well, they synthesized existing good practices from international guidance and national regulatory frameworks for securing dangerous chemicals and other hazardous materials. There was a consultative group that the project stood up, from which my office and others, including the OPCW, participated in. There are two elements of the document. So one is a recommended chemical security content, and then a step-by-step guidance on unrecommended steps to how to adopt a national chemical security framework. Next slide. I will not read all of the slide in detail, but wanted to show this to illustrate. These are the international and national regimes that the project took under consideration and synthesized for the framework project. Next slide. So I know we're doing questions at the end. This is my contact information. If you have any questions about any of the projects initiatives I spoke to today, please reach out. I'd be happy to take your questions at the end of this panel or during one of the coffee breaks. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I guess I'm the only one, at least from this particular panel, who is not really from the United States. I am from the Philippines, and I come from the university that actually deals a lot with CBRN health security. And over the last so many years, we have partnered with various organizations in relation to the different aspects of chemical, biological, and radiological nuclear emergencies, and has been advising the Philippine government. So I'd just like to say that I am a member of the CBRN national team, and that's how I get roped into all this discussion. But this particular presentation, of course, follows the principle of no attribution. And this is also a presentation that will focus only on the assistance being given to the Philippines by the United States, but without prejudice to those which we have received from OPCW and other international organizations and bilateral agreements. So next, please. So one of the things I realized is that when a country asks for assistance, that's going to be something that they will really try to work on. And therefore, it's important when a donor offers assistance to find out whether this is actually what the country needs. Because unless this is what we need, then maybe it will really be just a theoretical discussion, and then it will end up being forgotten later on. So the Philippines has what we call a CBRN National Action Plan, and this was approved by the Philippine government, particularly the Anti-Terrorism Council, as Resolution 40. It's a living strategic document on what we want in relation to CBRN risk mitigation. And so with that particular introduction, I'd like to be able to say that part of this, of course, relies heavily on mitigating risk associated with the use of chemical weapons and chemical agents. Just as an anecdote, I remember being here many, many years ago. I think it was in 2011 when OPCW was about to finish the destruction of the stockpiles of chemical weapons. And I was asked to come here to advise the director then about a way forward for the OPCW. And I remember saying, because of the many cases of poisoning that we have encountered and managed, that maybe it's important to deal with toxic industrial chemicals. Because during the time, that wasn't really the focus of OPCW. And considering the need of different countries, chemical safety is still an important issue, even if most of the discussion with OPCW then was on chemical security. Next, please. So with that, in our CBRN National Action Plan, we had a set of chemical specific objectives, and of course, the strengthening and the creation of the national implementation law for the Chemical Weapons Convention has been very important. We know, for example, that even as we deal with the chemical security framework, it's still very important to have this national implementation law. What we have in place, of course, is an executive order by the President, Aquino, Benigno Aquino Jr., and that came about because of a visit where we brought one of our policymakers to talk to the Department of Homeland Security way back in 2011, where we had this discussion about the anti-terrorism assistance, the anti-terrorism facility standards, and we also talked about chemicals of interest, and therefore we modeled our desire to have our own chemicals of security concern adapted to the local situation. And so that was part of what we wanted, and therefore reached out to the US government to be able to help us design a program for chemicals of security concern. Of course, there are other objectives included in this particular slide. I don't have time to discuss them, but if there is any interest in the open forum, or I will actually give you my email at the end, then maybe we can actually have a discussion towards it as well. Next, please. So in as far as the chemical security framework is concerned, so as I've said, it came out as a need that we identified ourselves. So with that, the government, interagency, the different members of the CBRN national team for 2 years during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, we continued to work on this issue of the chemical security framework, looking at what we can actually create as a regulation, and eventually maybe a policy that is signed by the president, and without neglecting the Chemical Weapons Convention Act that we wanted to pass. So within this particular 2 years that we were doing this kind of work, DTRA, the Department of the U.S. Department of Defense Threat Reduction Agency, has helped us come up with some guidelines together with PNNL on what the chemicals of security concern are. Of course, in that list is included the CWC scheduled list of chemicals and others which the country finds very important because they are used in industry and day-to-day life, but at the same time poses a risk to the community, to the nation, and perhaps even at the regional level. So again, when we talk about a series of regulatory meetings, we now have 2 major working groups that came out of this chemical security framework. One that is polishing the list, because this is a living list. And of course, the regulatory framework, which is being led by our Anti-Terrorism Council. We know that we have an Anti-Terrorism Act, which also will deal with weapons of mass destruction. But this is something that is going to deal also with chemicals that are being used by industry, academia, and therefore they have legitimate purposes, but they can be diverted towards bad intention by certain actors. So again, we are in the process of working with the Office of Audrey Spears to have a workshop this coming July, because we recognize that risk assessment is very important. And again, risk management is something that we want to be able to do. I think what is important when we were discussing this in the Philippines is that our policymakers need to understand the reality of the threat. I can talk about it, but the people will always say you're a medical doctor and you're a professor, but you are not a regulator. So in that aspect, we are looking at the examples that the United States really had as actual examples where threat existed, and having a chemical security regime was actually helpful in mitigating the threat. Next, please. So one of the things we also are going to do in partnership with US DTRA is actually the National Virtual Training Center. We did have the groundbreaking already of this virtual center. This actually includes a biological and a chemical domain for this virtual training center. We talked about the virtual training center a lot because the pandemic has shown us that it is important to have a very good training facility, even when there is like something that prevents you from seeing each other face to face. And so this particular facility will have, of course, a BSL-2 laboratory for those who have worked in the biosphere as well. But for the chemical part, there will be like simulation areas where you can have the ability to design a physical security program. Hopefully it will end up that way. So in a virtual reality, understand the threats that are posed by certain chemicals, and therefore make sure that the facility has the security that is necessary. So that's just an example of how we will be using that particular virtual training facility. Next, please. So the other thing that we have been doing over the last 2 years of the pandemic is really to engage with Interpol in a project, again, partly funded by the US government, and that is in the chemical risk identification and management program. So this is, again, multi-agency. We look at what the different agencies of the Philippine government have under their portfolio. For example, if we talk about our Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency, we look at their chemical precursors for drugs of abuse. And of course, we also have those which are governed by the Philippine National Police. We have a specific Republic Act, and that's Republic Act 9515, which is dealing with explosives. So there are different agencies of the Philippine government. But what is very interesting is that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources feels, and they include Environmental Management Bureau under them, should not participate in chemical security, and that their mandate is only on chemical safety. But in reality, if you think about it, they have a long list of what they call priority chemical list, and cyanide is included in that list. And as cyanide enters the country, they're supposed to be able to register cyanide, know where it goes, how it's transported, and therefore be able to also find out who is using it. We know that cyanide, of course, is very much important in the mining industry after the regulation for mercury took over, that we should no longer use mercury. But at the same time, we know that cyanide can easily be used by malicious actors. And we have seen a lot of cyanide poisoning in the Philippines that come because of the diversion of some of the cyanide and placed in plastic bottles like this and accidentally drank by our by our toddlers because they thought it was water. It was being used to make your jewelry brighter and shinier. So it's a jewelry cleaning solution made up of cyanide, nitric acid as one of the components, and therefore, again, poses a security risk because it might be something that, law enforcement people might suddenly ingest in an operation. Next, please. Okay, so this is basically what we have seen over the last few engagement that we have had with the US government. So we're working on the regulatory framework. We're doing some kind of industry outreach. But one interesting thing that I actually had with the industry recently, they asked me to talk to them about Chemical Weapons Convention 101 and the Biological Weapons Convention 101. What does that mean? While we talk about several engagement with industry in relation to chemical security, the convention itself seems to be something that some of the people in industry are really not aware of. So I think now that the review conference is forthcoming, that was a small grant that came from the US government. We were able to do that virtual workshop dealing with chemical weapons and biological weapons 101 to really jumpstart the discussion with industry partners to be able to understand the convention better. So there's also this issue about responding to threats or releases of chemicals. We have had so many assistance given to us by the US government. The US Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program gave us equipment, training. We also had now the US DTRA giving us equipment and training. And so maybe that's the partnership that can also be done with OPCW. If OPCW is able to add to the training, but does not have the equipment, then maybe that's a partnership to draw upon the synergy of cooperation between the US and OPCW. In terms of utilizing what has been given to us, there was mention about the desire to have local trainers. That in the proof of concept of a train the trainers program is the ability of that country to become a trainer themselves. And I think the Philippines has done that a lot in different aspects, and we are fortunate that the training given by the US, we have gone to the extent of live agent training. It was given to us. We have recently we were given equipment very recently, even for the medical CBRN. So again, That's where maybe if there is a donor who can give the curriculum but does not have the equipment, then putting them together will actually help make things better in terms of training and in a more sustainable fashion. Next, please. So in the last bullet, there was something there about outside of regulatory control. So many of the times we don't really talk about toxins because we think biotoxins should be under the umbrella of Biological Weapons Convention. But I know that there are toxins also included in the scheduled list of the Chemical Weapons Convention, such as saxitoxin, for example. So there are various toxins within the region of the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia that has become of certain interest and has been a subject of conversation. And these are abrin, ricin, of course, is familiar not only for Asia, because I know that in Germany there were threats that were associated with ricin. And again, of course, quercene, which is a relative of ricin, and it comes from a plant called Jatropha quercus. It became prominent in the region because it was identified in 2006 as an alternative biofuel. So what you can see here is sometimes when we propose a particular intervention, like planting this Jatropha quercus, we also open the doors for new threats because there are certain actors in the region who might be interested in getting them. So what does this now entail? So over the last 2 years, we have had this virtual discussion about how these toxins can be a threat to law enforcement people and to public health. And we have been doing this training program. And just very recently, of course, this is not with the Philippines. Again, this is a U.S. Department of State funded activity. I went to Jakarta to work with their law enforcement and forensic people, particularly on the health consequences of exposure to these toxins, because I'm a medical doctor and a toxicologist. But at the same time, sharing with them also our own experiences with respect to how deadly these toxins can be. You know, people talk about VX, but abrin is even more toxic than VX. So I think there's really room for OPCW to also engage in this kind of discussion because these agents are being explored for their dual use potential as a therapeutic agent. So it's being discussed in terms of its potential for anti-cancer, and therefore access to this will become even more, and therefore outside of regulation and research control, then maybe this is something that we really need to be discussing. And of course, there's recent interest also on pharmaceutical-based agents related to fentanyl and carfentanil for first responders who might suddenly be exposed to these kinds of dangers. So with that, I think that's my last second. Can you show me the next slide? Oh, this is just the contact information of Michelle. I find it difficult to pronounce her name, but she's the lady from the US DTRA. She had wanted to be able to do her presentation, so I actually did discuss some of it. And of course, the next slide will be my contact information. Next, please. So should there be any question in the open forum, I'd be happy to answer them. But all I can say is that our CBRN National Action Plan is a good platform for synergy. So we have realized that over the years, we need to be able to find out what is actually being offered as assistance by the US government, by the European Union, for example, so that we build on what has been given and rather than just duplicate them. So with that, I'd say thank you very much.
Thank you to all the panelists for these very informative presentations. And the floor is open for questions and comments.
Emin, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Manso, and thank you, Professor Yilmaz, for your elaborative presentation. And I'm from Bangladesh, and from our perspective, Bangladesh being the 8th largest country in terms of population in the world and a rising developing nation in the South Asia. So our chemical industry and chemical use is mostly goes to our industry for domestic purpose and also for apparel uses, because we are the second largest RMG producers next to China. Last year we had one of the worst chemical incident in Bangladesh in Chittagong that killed about 49 people, and Out of them, 5 were from the fire service and civil defense, and injured about 45 people, 450 people. And the damage was about 90 million US dollar worth of goods and 200 million US dollar of empty containers. But the problem is that when we talk about, or in the OPCW, we only talk about the toxic chemicals, but we don't say much about the chemicals that have the potential of being explosive, because what we had, it was a chemical explosion. So how, Madam, in your experience with the OPCW and your with the US Department of State and in this kind of international cooperation and assistance, you see that, don't you think that the explosive chemicals should also be a part of the international cooperation and assistance? Because what we need, we need to develop our capacity building in terms of storing and also transporting those chemicals. And because when it goes inside the industry, there is a set protocol to hold or use those chemicals. But when it is outside the industry facility, it is transported or stored. That is not much of a plan. So, Madam, if you kindly elaborate, and particularly since I'm from Bangladesh, my interest is on how actually we can, being here in the OPCW, we can guide our national authorities and the industry people to help develop their national programs to secure those chemicals. Thank you.
So I think that question is directed to me. Okay. Yes.
Since you have this experience with dealings, but
Yes.
anyone can.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things one of our worst disaster in terms of the use of explosives happened actually in a shipping. So it was a maritime disaster. People did not recognize at first that this was really a terrorist-related event. So in that particular event in 2004, it took several months before people realized that an explosive was placed inside the television set, and it targeted the children on board, because that particular vessel actually carried the children who competed and won in a contest. So it was really very dramatic, and the president of the Philippines finally admitted it was an explosive and it was intentional. So what we can see from these kinds of experiences is that while there is regulation in place, implementation is actually sometimes really a big problem. So we have actual laws related to explosives that are actually governed under what I mentioned a while ago as the Republic Act 9515. You can actually Google it in the internet. It will list high-risk chemicals and that includes explosives. So we have our laws governed by the Philippine National Police. And of course, aside from the police, the Bureau of Fire Protection in the Philippines has a unique mandate, because its mandate allows it to follow the chemical in its entire life cycle, from its creation to its storage, use, transport, and then eventually to its disposal. Because some of the chemicals which are considered to be waste already also contains dangerous chemicals. So we have that kind of mechanism in place, and therefore we have been trying our best to train both our police and our Bureau of Fire Protection to be able to deal with these kinds of explosives. Just to let you know, our own government, the Philippine government, is funding a workshop for our Philippine National Police. And we will be training them on the very simple thing like the safety data sheet, so that when they look at chemicals, specifically the explosives that they need to monitor, they will know also how to deal with it. And the safety data sheets will be very important. So this is just some examples of work that we have been doing. And of course, it's very important because sometimes you think of very high level examples, and I'm happy that you asked that question, because we also want to deal with ammonium nitrate. And of course, there's another regulatory body that governs that in the Philippines, and that's the Fertilizer Pesticide Authority. So there are really multiple agencies for some of the chemicals, and that's the reason why we're creating this chemical security framework and a threat mapping tool, which will help us identify where the threats are, and the different agencies who need to license them, because there can be multiple agencies involved. I hope I answered you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll jump in two different angles. So one for the Global Congress on Chemical Security Emerging Threats. So that just doesn't focus on the chemical weapons or chemical weapon precursors, but also is open to explosive terrorism. So from that angle, from the dialogue and discussion, the Global Congress looks at kind of both sets of chemicals. And then from a U.S. domestic perspective, our CFATS regulation does include explosive chemicals as well as toxic chemicals and chemical weapon precursors on our list. We have a list of 322 chemicals that we regulate, and then you can also find that online through our on our CFATS website.
Thank you, madam. Like, if I may have a supplementary question, like in your cooperation and assistance program, so do you have or undergone any program that is not only focused on toxic chemical, but also chemicals that has a potential to be used as explosive, and training or capacity building of any country, or developing capacity of the local authorities?
So we have been having this workshop called the Chemical Risk Identification and Management Program. So I said this was being done together with Interpol, funded by US DTRA. So this particular workshop also helps us to look at explosive potentials of chemicals. So the moment this is, for example, somebody registers a particular chemical and there is this potential for it to become an explosive, especially if it is listed in our Republic Act, then that particular agency responsible should be able to have people who are trained. So we are also investing on their training at the moment. So what came out initially as a US funded activity, the government is doing its share now to ensure that these people, like the police, the law enforcement, the Bureau of Fire Protection, and of course our other regulatory agency who is very adamant in playing its role as a security cluster as well, which is our Department of Environment and Natural Resources Environmental Management Bureau, because these chemicals are under their control as well. So I think what you can actually do is to look at the mandates of your different government agencies, because there can really be a lot of overlap. And so that is what USDTRA tried to help us with in the cooperation project with on the chemical security framework. They analyzed all our existing regulatory frameworks when it comes to the different agencies that look at chemical explosive potentials and other chemicals of security concern. So USDTRA, maybe you can contact Michelle. The contact information is in the slide that I gave, so that you can reach out to them in relation to a chemical security framework that may govern explosives.
Give the floor to our colleague from Yemen, please.
Thank you. I have a question regarding the technical assistance. Maybe Audrey or Constantinos could answer about this. Professor Makili now has touched upon an important issue about the matching between the building capacity programs with the providing equipments. So I know Audrey has mentioned something about PPEs for a project in Tunisia. So my question in here, to what extent you provide equipment along with the building capacity project? The other question, maybe one of the distinguished panelists or Professor Makili now could answer about it. It's one of the identified challenges is the dropouts of the people that you invest in their capacities. Sometimes you spend and invest for quite sometimes for certain specialists, and suddenly, unfortunately, they leave their positions. So what is your policy for the dropout challenges? Thank you.
I might take a few questions and then we'll do another round here. If I can, to Ambassador Mandela from South Africa, also the chair of the Open-Ended Working Group on Terrorism.
Thank you very much, Director of Proceedings. I must apologize for my late arrival. I hope my apology was tendered, that I will not be here until now. Because I had another engagement. Of course, I missed out on the presentation. So the question I'm about to pose is on behalf of my colleague who's been here. It has to do with the matter relating to emerging threats. In particular, the use of artificial intelligence in launching attacks using chemical weapons, and I suspect this question might also be equally relevant for the next session with regard to how complex it is going to be for any investigations to be carried out with regard to the use of artificial intelligence. What is the origin of the attack? What is the origin of the weapon that has just been used, as to how, in your experiences, especially the panelists who've shared their views on chemical security and emerging threats, whether there are any particular experiences in your countries or generally in the work that you've done so far, which may have picked up on how best to respond to the use of artificial intelligence and how best to detect it in the circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I'll take one more question before I turn it back over to the panelists, if I may, Gidra from Lithuania.
Thank you very much to all panelists for the very interesting presentations. I have a quite specific question for Mr. Nikolaidis, if I may. In your last slide, I think you mentioned the programs on disinformation. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? What countries are interested in these trainings? What is the popularity of these programs? And to my understanding, your programs are kind of crafted to support the ongoing activities, also or to contribute to the work already done by OPCW, and OPCW, they don't have in their net the specific programs for disinformation. Do you think it's a time to do that, maybe to get OPCW more engaged in the topic? Thank you.
So a couple answers to a few of the questions here. I think to the first question on when we identify gaps, how we approach capacity building, I think this got to providing equipment and kind of training and knowledge in terms of utilizing that equipment. I think that was a question, sir. Certainly, it's a capacity that we have. We aim to design programs that obviously meet the needs of our partner states. Sometimes we can do this in one project. Sometimes this is iterative, where we are able to provide equipment and then conduct the training afterwards. So this is the work of, as I mentioned, many offices in our bureau. Certainly something we're always willing to discuss. And again, we design this in coordination with partner nations to meet their needs. To the ambassador's question on emerging threats and the use of artificial intelligence, probably a question for others here to answer. Obviously, artificial intelligence is a concern across many areas. It's something that on the programming side, we have not specifically focused on, but it's certainly something that if there were a way to address this through the use of our non-proliferation programs, we would be willing to look at. But maybe others can answer that question. And I see our senior director here coming to the table, which is great. And then again, the question from Lithuania. Sorry, I've forgotten I can't even read my scribbles here. Can you remind me?
Disinformation?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. The programs that I referenced are the domain of another office, so I really don't have specific details, but I'm happy to get you those later. Certainly, I think we would all benefit from looking at this information, and it is work that we're willing to discuss with partners, including the OPCW. So I think there's room to be done because there is a threat here that is excellent. Thank you.
So just to add to the disinformation side, so the U.S. Department of State did actually sponsor a series of workshops on disinformation during the COVID-19 times. I mean, it's still COVID-19, but during the height of the pandemic. And we had somebody from OPCW discussing, of course, the issue of the release of weapons during the civilian attack in Syria and so on. There were several topics that were considered. BWC also spoke. Different countries shared their knowledge on disinformation, differentiating this from misinformation, and of course, fake news. So those domains are actually, I think, very important so that people will not be suddenly alarmed by the ongoing disinformation or discrediting, for example, the value of a treaty or an organization itself. So I think there's room for OPCW to tackle disinformation as well. Thank you.
I just wanted to touch briefly on the AI and autonomy question, which I think is a great one in the domain of emerging technology as it relates to non-state actors. And hopefully we can take some cues in this community from some of the work that's been going on with relation to state actors. One item worth flagging, the United States recently released a set of political principles that we intend to subscribe to related to the use of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems for military capabilities. It is very much focused on state actors and state militaries, and it's designed to be a way for other countries to sort of analyze these principles and decide whether they view them as adequate to subscribe to as well, in an effort to start creating more of a normative framework governing artificial intelligence and autonomous systems as they relate to military capabilities. I think that what you would notice in these principles, which we're happy to share, is that at least in spirit, I think that we would want states to consider how to use these principles to regulate the activities of non-state actors if that became relevant. There is obviously a broader focus than just WMD threats related to these principles, but clearly we would want them to apply to WMD as well. But we can send that information around if there's genuine interest in that, even if that's not the direct focus of today's discussion. Thanks.
So I'm not an expert on AI, but this has been a subject of discussion as well in our work. So there's this issue about AI, machine learning, additive manufacturing technology such as the 3D printer, and people are looking at it as a way of designing molecules, making it more easy for people. So now we know that there's a lot of restrictions brought about by regulations. Then maybe using now these kinds of modalities will allow us to make it easier for the synthesis. Of course, this is something that people are looking at. Maybe it's not as easy as we think it is, but there's that kind of information. And in the recent workshop that we had for chemical risk identification, the other delivery device, dispersal device that we are really looking at is the drone, because that is something that can really carry chemicals, or even, there was an attempt to disperse fecal material, I think, in one meeting using the drone. So the drone technology can really be an important delivery device.
Yeah, I'll jump in as well and say that the use of AI and drones and 3D printing has been a source of conversation on the emerging threat side in the Global Congress. There has not been a lot of conversations on how to mitigate these risks, how to address it. So definitely we'll be looking to those policy directives for the next meeting. I will say that there is a flip side to the benefits of what we've heard in the artificial intelligence and machine learning, especially with people looking at how to detect suspicious transactions. So I talked earlier about the range of sophistication methods that industry and regulators use to identify suspicious transactions, and some of those some of the more sophisticated methods do rely on AI and machine learning. So think there's the dual-edged sword, some opportunity to leverage that to assist in the chemical security mission. Going back to Yemen's question about matchmaking programs and PPE. So through just two ways, the Global Congress, that request for technical assistance, that is not the forum to put in requests for PPEs. It's more of a peer-to-peer information sharing. But the Global Partnership, the Chemical Security Working Group, does issue call for matchmaking proposals. And I have seen before, requests for equipment and training and full packages. So just jumping off of that for the plug for the GP matchmaking. But yeah, I think that's it.
Unless there are any questions, I think we'll take this opportunity for a break. We'll come back in 10 minutes or so with our second panel. I just also mentioned if anybody has any specific questions they'd like to ask the panelists, after our second panel, we'll have a coffee reception just outside of this room. And that's an opportunity to come talk one-on-one if desired. And so we'll start back up at 3 o'clock and look forward to seeing you then. All right, colleagues, we'll start with our second panel here. Pleased to introduce three colleagues. One is Mr. Tony Malloy. He's an assistant legal attaché from the U.S. Embassy here in The Hague with the FBI, as well as Mr. Robert Bull, a forensic examiner, FBI lab from Quantico, Virginia. We're also joined by a distinguished colleague from the Technical Secretariat, Mr. Solomon Abebi Hale, on my left. So we'll start with the presentations and follow this section with a discussion as we did with the first panel. I'll turn it over to you, Tony.
So thank you. Thank you. I know Ambassador Manso is not with us right now, but I want to thank my colleagues from the U.S. Permanent Representative to OPCW for this kind invite and for OPCW for hosting myself and my colleague. As Alex mentioned, I'm Tony Malloy. I'm an FBI attaché assigned here to the U.S. Embassy in The Hague. My portfolio here is counterterrorism and weapons of mass destruction. So this presentation seeks to provide a general overview of FBI's global efforts and engagements to mitigate the threats posed by chemical weapons to the United States and U.S. interests across the globe. It's a short presentation given the time constraints, but I'm looking forward to having a good substantive exchange. Next slide, please. So since the FBI is one of many contributors in the U.S. government to this threat, to the issue of mitigating the threat posed by chemical weapons, it'd be helpful to show the FBI's mission to provide some context. So FBI is the largest U.S. federal law enforcement agency charged with the mission of protecting the American people and upholding the Constitution. We do this through predicated investigations, investigating violations of U.S. federal law, and investigating threats to the United States interest, both domestically and internationally. The FBI has jurisdiction in the United States government to conduct lawful federal, criminal, and national security investigations, operations, activities, engagements worldwide, in close coordination with domestic and international law enforcement partners, public safety, security services, and public and private institutions. Next slide, please. So the FBI is organized to address our missions and priorities. We're comprised generally of four core mission centers: our criminal and cyber, national security branch, which is counterintelligence and counterintelligence, weapons of mass destruction, counterterrorism, our intelligence branch, and our science and technology branch. So the FBI's weapons of mass destruction directorate resides in the national security side of the house, and the mission is to prevent and mitigate CBRNE threats worldwide. The U.S. government practices CBRNE threat mitigation and in macro and in particular chemical weapons threat mitigation, utilizing a whole of government approach to detect, deter, disrupt, and dismantle bad actors. FBI conducts extensive engagement domestically and internationally in furtherance of our mission, and internationally our principal areas of foreign engagement are preparedness, information exchange, and investigative assistance and support. So within the FBI, the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, we have three sections. All sections are comprised three functional areas that each contribute to our mission in countering and mitigating the chemical weapon threat. The FBI's international liaison engagement on the WMD portfolio is largely conducted through our international legal attaché program, who is responsible for foreign engagement on both the bilateral and the multilateral areas, coordinating and facilitating international cooperation and collaboration efforts, and coordinating and facilitating FBI's international and investigative assistance and support programs. And those, so of the four regional areas that we cover Western Europe through the Netherlands, Western Europe, and Europol through the Netherlands. I have a colleague in Romania that covers Eurasia. I have a colleague in the UAE that covers the Middle East and North Africa. And I have a colleague in Indonesia that covers the Pacific and Asia. This is just a crude chart depicting FBI's perspective of where the chemical weapon threat falls within the spectrum of CBRNE threats on a risk probability graph. So you'll see what the bolded chemical weapons, that's generally sophisticated agents that are designed and intended to be weaponized, whereas moving to the right is the toxic industrial chemicals and the pharmaceutical-based agents that are dual-purpose agents that are more prevalent and readily available. So the FBI can employ a full range of investigative and operational capabilities throughout the entire life cycle of a chemical weapon attack, from aspiration to operational, based on information, allegation, articulable reasonable facts, indicating a threat to national security and or a violation of U.S. federal law. We can also provide investigative assistance and support through our legitimate bilateral and multilateral engagements. Next slide, please. Of course, we cannot, the FBI is unable to mitigate the chemical weapon threat by ourselves. We're very reliant on partnerships and engagements across the full spectrum, government, industry, and academia. This slide is just intended to depict the trending chemical weapons threats or particular concern to international law enforcement based on factors including availability, ease of use, and lethality. So of course you have the improvised chemical dispersal devices, generally intended to envelop a crowd in a toxic industrial chemical to kill or injure masses. This would be, you see, we saw examples of this during the coalition fight in Iraq, where some of our insurgents used vehicle-borne explosive devices to disperse chlorine agents. It's cheap and easy, readily available materials. However, it lacks sophistication, both in the manufacture and in the actor use. They don't take into account weather conditions and thermal effects of perhaps the dispersal, which make them generally ineffective. As far as the toxic industrial chemicals, the FBI assesses that toxic industrial chemicals are the most likely material extremists or criminals would use in a chemical attack in the United States, based on the relative ease with which they are acquired through purchase or theft, ease of dispersal, and ability to be handled without advanced training or knowledge. See on the slide. You can see it. Go back. Thank you. The fourth generation agents, the Novicheks and the A series, nerve agents, they pose unique challenges and risks to first responders, law enforcement, fire and emergency medical services due to toxicity, detection, persistence, and delayed onset of symptoms. Despite the Novichok attack in the UK in 2018, the threat of FGAs by the FBI is actually assessed to be relatively low. However, following that attack in the UK, the White House convened a working group, and one of the things out of that working group that came an information awareness and a training program that the FBI has a component of for first responders, fire, and emergency service personnel. And then there's the pharmaceutical-based agents, and these are chemical threat agents, including synthetic opioids or non-opioids. These are your fentanyl compounds, and some of the sedatives like veterinarian use sedatives that are either pose a threat for either accidental exposure or deliberate exposure. And we saw the actual fentanyl compound being used as a incapacitating agent by the Russians during the Dubrovka museum or theater attack in 2002. So this is a busy slide, but generally just says, so the weapon of mass destruction, the FBI's directorate for this, we lead the FBI's readiness and preparedness efforts through several domestic and international initiatives across all sectors of society, as I mentioned, global, or government, industry, and academia. So tripwires to the top, those are proactive initiatives that we engage with in the United States, designed to identify risks, inform, and educate stakeholders on threat indicators, and develop public-private relationships to report suspicious activities and mitigate potential threats. So the case study that's shown here is the mustard gas and chlorine used in Syria, Iraq. The U.S. created a tripwire domestically on this, focusing on components of mustard gas, so that because mustard gas, the components of it not being illegal, if you had somebody seeking to purchase that didn't have a good explanation, there would be an awareness to notify law enforcement so that we actually do a threat assessment on that. Partnership and outreach. So the FBI uses this one in particular here, the chemical industry outreach. We use a couple of vehicles to do that. Domestically, we have a system called InfraGuard, which is a public-private relationship that we engage with critical infrastructure industries, including the chemical industry. And that it's designed actually to have and develop relationships and to inform, bidirectionally inform both us on the government side of the house and our private partners on potential threats. It's actually very effective. We've deployed something called actually our State Department officials or colleagues run the Overseas Security Advisory Council, which is something similar to that, where it's an outreach program, again, just made to develop the relationships and identify potential risks. Law enforcement, first responder and training initiatives that we have. Domestically, as I mentioned before, one of the White House initiatives came out of the Novichok. This is an international and domestic program that we do in the U.S. government. We do that at all levels of government, starting at the federal level, down to state, municipal, tribal engagements. And then we also have an international engagement program that includes law enforcement and first responder and fire life safety officials as well. Some of my colleagues have mentioned it. The FBI is party to the Global Congress. We're also engaged with some of our North African colleagues in Morocco and Tunisia on this Atlas program. And then CRIMP, as my colleague from the Philippines mentioned before. Slide, please. This slide is just a summary of the FBI's principal areas of foreign engagement, again, on the preparedness side of the house. So preparedness would include things like training, capacity building, knowledge exchange, expertise exchange, et cetera. Information exchange, so it's be bi-directional between the FBI and any partner that we had in that area, including our international partner engagements, and investigative assistance and support. As I mentioned, so the FBI has our own organic authorities to conduct investigations. However, if one of our foreign partners or domestic partners for that, in the same instance, would come to us and ask for investigative response, we have vehicles where we can provide that response. Next slide, please. So given the venue and the audience here, I thought it would be notable and noteworthy to mention the FBI's role in the OPCW-led inspections of chemical facilities in the United States. So the FBI is committed to support the U.S. government's obligations to comply with the CWC, and part of that would be our role in these on-site inspections in the U.S. So the FBI presence is actually mandated by Congress, and essentially, though this outlines some of the scope of our involvement, but really what it comes down to is our main objective is to ensure the on-site inspections are conducted safely, lawfully, and without incident. So I recognize the presentation was brief and it didn't really kind of provide a lot of details. However, I invite your questions. I think at the end of the panel, I'll be followed by my colleague, Dr. Robert Bull from the FBI lab. Thank you.
I guess while the slides are coming up, my name's Rob Bull. I actually work for the laboratory division out of Quantico. I've been a forensic examiner with the lab for probably about 15 years, which means I kind of execute casework. When these events happen, they have an examiner assigned to them to make sure that the examinations are done appropriately and all the documentation is put in place so that when we get all the way through the exams, we're prepared to go into the legal process. Next slide. The unit I work for is called Scientific Response and Analysis Unit. It used to be CBRN. It's had all kinds of different names, but the reality is you're analyzing something, you're using scientific principles to do it, and our unit's responsible for analyzing any CBRN type material. What we need to make sure we do, and we do it efficiently, is we need to make sure we collect the evidence from the crime scene. We need to make sure we provide oversight for the analysis of the target analyte, whether it's a chemical warfare agent, or radiological or biological material. We want to ensure all forensic disciplines are applied to it, and I think I'm going to spend a good amount of my time here talking about that because I think that's one of the most important things to do, is not lose sight of when you collect this evidence, it's part of a crime, and all the other forensic disciplines need to be able to apply to that sample as well. And then we also support training to our field offices, and also provide support on hazmat scenes. If the scene's sufficiently complex, one of our scientists is actually sent to the scene anywhere in the U.S. when the collection occurs. Next slide. So the key point here is if you have a crime scene, you have a crime scene, right? It doesn't matter if it has biological, chemical, or radiological material, it's a crime scene. And all the principles that law enforcement in your countries and in our country have developed to process a crime scene need to be applied to that crime scene, regardless of the fact of the agent that you're dealing with. It creates some unique challenges, right? I mean, you have to have a facility to be able to take that evidence to and do the exams, or you have to have a plan to do the forensic exams in the contaminated crime scene. You need to evaluate what you're going to do and how you're going to apply those traditional forensics. Like what I explained to folks, when I get a ricin case that comes into the laboratory, we identify that the ricin toxin is present in the tube. The first question the agent asks me is, well, where did it come from? That's probably answered by the fingerprints on the outside of the tube. So that's the kind of thing we move very quickly towards. I've been working for the FBI for about 15 years. I've been working in this field for over 20. And I can tell you, early on when I started in this field, there was this big push to decontaminate evidence so traditional forensics could occur on it. We haven't done that in 15 years. If the item comes in contaminated, it stays contaminated. If we need to do computer forensics or fingerprints or question documents, we do it all inside containment or the appropriate engineering controls to protect the people doing the work. The forensics does not solve your case. It gives a set of facts. Those facts are very helpful. They give leads to the investigators. They give those facts kind of limit the possibilities where that evidence may have come from and how it may have come to be in that site. But it's all part of the process. And I think that's another important point I want to make sure folks understand. Next slide. Next slide. Is we have lots and lots of scientific equipment we can apply to a sample to analyze it. Just because you have the equipment to analyze the sample doesn't mean you should analyze the sample with those pieces of equipment. It has to be answering a probative question, a question that the investigator or the courts need to have information on to make a judgment as to how this event happened and who's responsible for it. We've done a lot of work with many of these pieces of equipment on the slide here. They have their applications for different types of questions. It may be a question about the consistency of multiple different lots. It may be a question of, the exact synthesis pathway that was used to produce this material. All those are important questions that have to be answered and have to be answered in a forensic context. Next slide. The U.S. government is lucky. We have 2 OPCW labs in the U.S. The first one is at Edgewood. It's run by the Army, a very good lab, and the FBI takes advantage of that lab being present in the U.S. That's where we're going to do our forensic analysis of materials associated with potential chemical warfare agent or something that's a highly toxic industrial compound or a toxic industrial material. The key attributes, they certainly can do the chemical warfare agents. They have mass spectroscopy, inductive coupled plasma MS, NMR. This is one of our facilities. We tend to use this for kind of larger samples just because of the other logistics that are present on the base to be able to support it. Next slide. The other key facility is Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Happens to be on the West Coast. One is on the East Coast. That kind of works out well. If a case starts on the West Coast, we're going to the West Coast lab. It starts on the East Coast, it's going to Edgewood. If it happens in the middle, we'll figure it out. Depends which way the planes are flying at that time of day. It is an ISO 17025 lab. It is an OPCW lab. Does chemical analysis, but the other capability this lab brings to us is carbon-14 dating. I do a lot of bio cases also, and sometimes understanding how old the material is a key part of understanding what analysis is necessary. If you find a bone fragment, I know it's outside the chemical discussion here, you want to know how old that bone is before you start DNA typing it. Because if it's 400 years old, you're probably not going to solve the crime. The last lab we use is the National Bioforensic Analysis Center. This is not an OPCW lab, but there are biological toxins out there. The NBFAC is ISO 17025 accredited, can handle any kind of bio threat all the way up to BL4, has EM, microscopy, proteomics, significant amounts of whole genomics capability. If you're going to identify a biological toxin, not only identify the toxins good, you want to start pulling the DNA from that material because that's going to be informative to be able to link different lots back to each other and also look at a common source. Next slide. So the goals for chem forensics is really anything that the investigator wants to know. They want to know what the chemical is, what is the contaminants in the sample. This is a yellow liquid. Why is it yellow? Is there some other compound in there? Is there some metal mixed in there? We need to understand that. Is it linked to any other incidents? If you have 2 different chemical warfare events, you want to understand if that was one lot produced or you're having multiple lots produced, and are they using one pathway? Looking for traditional forensics, I'll get to a little more at the end of the talk here. How was it made? When was it made? You can look at aging and how it degrades over time. And you can also start to look at stable isotopes. These are methods that many labs have around the world to be able to do analysis. It's really applying them appropriately to the case for a forensic purpose. Next slide. I kind of put this slide up. It's a little bit busy, but I just want to kind of reiterate, when you do an investigation for a forensic purpose, there's a lot of steps, and each of those steps needs to be covered. They need to be documented, and the end goal is to be able to take that information into court. If you don't do a good job at your chain of custody, you're not getting your results into court. Also, as you're doing the investigation and you're doing the analysis, we provide leads back to our case agents almost daily. When we're doing an investigation, we want to let them know what we're seeing, so as they're interviewing folks, they have the best set of facts at the time to conduct those interviews. And I think that's an important thing, that we bring to the picture and supporting other folks when they work cases like this. Next slide. So the last part of the talk, I'm really going to focus on how you bring traditional forensics into it. You know, when you get that sample, you know, who did it versus what it is. What it is, once I've told somebody, the case agent or, you know, the investigator, what it is, their next question is, well, okay, where did it come from? And, you know, just knowing what it is isn't going to tell you where it came from. Knowing what it is and how it was produced might give you some leads about it, but it's not going to tell you where it came from. Being able to apply a lot of the traditional forensics to the sample is how you figure out where it came from. Next slide. FBI has something called a hazardous evidence analysis team. This actually came out of the anthrax incident in the US in the early 2000s. When the FBI had those samples come into their custody, we didn't have the ability to have a forensic photographer take a picture of those pieces of evidence. All those things weren't in place. We got them in place very quickly, which is a good thing, but we've really developed the program to be very robust, to be able to handle all different types of hazards, including all different sizes of hazards, you know, everything from a tube to the size of a refrigerator or bigger. And how do you process those pieces of evidence? And you can't have examiners who are fingerprint examiners waiting around just to do CBRN cases. They need to be trained to do CBRN cases, and they need to be pulled into them when you need them, but they need to practice their regular discipline on a daily basis, and that's how we operate. Next slide. So with chemical and agent analysis, we break it into a whole bunch of questions, and our goal is to be able to answer those questions simultaneously. We'll be taking the chemical analysis, and that'll be happening with chemists. We'll be taking the physical analysis, the computer forensics, the question documents. If there's explosives involved, we may even have our explosives device folks and chemists involved in the analysis, and all those things are happening simultaneously so that we're able to, as those analyses complete, feed the information back to the field offices and our case agents so that they can apply them appropriately to the case. It looks very complicated. It can be very complicated, and in the middle of the case, the communications associated with this can be almost overwhelming when you have results coming out every few hours. But we've gotten very good payoffs by using this approach. And when I say the payoff is being able to make sure that case agent knows a set of facts before they do the interviews. Because it's very helpful if somebody starts lying about something, there's probably something else there you want to figure out.
If I could just ask colleagues online to mute their mics. Thank you.
Yep, next slide. So the next slide is kind of a list of the different disciplines. Every discipline that we have available in the FBI is actually represented in HEAT. You know, when I first started in this field, I never thought about doing computer forensics on a biologically contaminated piece of evidence or a chemically contaminated piece of evidence. That's something you have to do. If the cell phone or the computer that was in the person's house is what you need to be able to exploit, you need to have a process to be able to get a copy of that hard drive from a contaminated article and have your copy outside of contamination. I mean, they're the kinds of things that we've spent a lot of time working on. We've talked with colleagues around the world about. I've definitely learned lessons from some of the things I've seen colleagues do around the world that have certainly been able to help us. And that's part of the reason I'm here to kind of talk about what we do. So with our forensic examiners in different disciplines, really the training commitment, we can normally get the training done within about a week to cover all three disciplines. We do make sure that they get an exercise before we have a real incident for them to do an exam on, because the worst thing to do is throw them right into a real case. But things have worked pretty well. We do see obstacles, but we're able to kind of engineer around those obstacles, and it's typically coming up with, you know, creative solutions to be able to deal with it. The last slide here is just, well, second to last slide is just kind of a picture of some of our examiners working. These are the different conditions they have to work in. In some cases, we'll build glove bags to be able to contain things. In other conditions, we're working in, you know, PAPRs or even in a BL4 suit if we're dealing with the BL4 agent for the bio. And the chem, we certainly take advantage of the OPCW labs ability to support those type of exams. I also think I probably know where every large chemical fume hood in the US is, where I can put something really big in it. That's one thing I've learned over the years. next slide, and this is my last technical slide, is when we do analysis, we kind of work under a principle. In the US, it's called the Daubert principle. It has to do with the admissibility of scientific evidence into court, but it's actually a pretty good sound foundation for how you do the exams and why you do the exams and what exams you allow to happen. First, the exam has to be relevant. I showed you this list of all those scientific instruments. You could run every single analysis and maybe 3 of the instruments are relevant. So before you start, you kind of figure out what is the relevant question for the investigator. The last part of it really has to do with reliability. We ran into this in some of our cases where we have researchers coming up with these wonderful solutions to do analysis that haven't been tested, are so cutting edge, the relevant scientific community hasn't even vetted them yet. Being able to vet those things is very important to us, and it being able to be accepted by that community is very important to us. In the case of chemical or biological forensics, it's an international community. I mean, there are researchers in almost every country. If we can show that we're doing analysis that's consistent with the analysis that would be done in Europe, Asia, Africa, it's a common method, it's a relevant method, and it's going to go through our legal system a lot easier. So, you know, our approach from where I sit in my part of the FBI is we push for publications. We want things published. We want them out in the open. We want to make sure that other folks have access to them. And if somebody can improve it, we want to be able to pull those improvements into our laboratory. We also want to understand what the potential error rates are. There are statistics associated with things. We work them up front. And I think the last slide was questions, but we're taking questions after the last talk. So thank you for your time.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished meeting participants. My name is Solomon Haile. I'm with Implementation Support Branch of the International Cooperation and Assistance Division of the OPCW. I'm like the professor from the Philippines, one of the non-US speakers, but I'm pretty much on the same agenda as our US colleagues. In terms of dealing with non-proliferation and related issues. The encounter this afternoon is a conversation about future priorities, current and emerging priorities of our state parties, communicated through and by national CWC authorities, are priorities that inform the design and rollout of capacity development activities at the International Cooperation and Assistance Division. These priorities should be captured systematically and iteratively. The priorities should come out of a strategic planning and programming process led and owned by national authorities. This is why this afternoon I'll be speaking about a tool that is expected to facilitate a move away from spontaneous mode of engagement, the tool that would allow a shift towards proactive and more structured format, enabling more efficient identification and prioritization of priorities. This tool is called National Implementation Framework. That would be my first topic of conversation. And the second part will focus on a specific project that we are implementing in collaboration with the US government. Next slide, please. Yeah, International Cooperation and Assistance Division. It's led by a director, and it has 3 branches: Implementation Support Branch, Assistance and Protection Branch, International Cooperation Branch. We have a cross-cutting principles that help us design and implement our programs. And first and foremost is responsiveness to the state parties' needs, coordinated programming, partnership and collaboration, strategic and forward-looking, adaptiveness to given operational circumstances. These three branches, which I have just mentioned, are respectively responsible for Article 7 of the Convention, which is about national implementation, Article 10 of the Convention, which is about assistance and protection, and Article 11 of the Convention, which is about promoting the use of chemistry for sustainable socio-economic development. My presentation will focus on Article 7, which is about national implementation. National implementation by all state parties is crucial for the success of the convention as a whole. Without implementing the convention at the national level, we cannot hope to achieve anything at all. So this is the vitally important. National implementation entails two types of state parties. One group of state parties have capacities in their national institutions. They do not require capacity development related support from the agency, but there are also a group of national authorities or state parties that require capacity development related support. So this national implementation framework, which is the topic of the conversation this afternoon, is about assisting those national authorities that require the support of the OPCW Technical Secretariat. The strategic context for the national implementation framework is the need for proactive, demand-driven, and long-term approach to national programming. As I indicated earlier, in some of the state parties, and the CWC national implementation exercises are kind of spontaneous and leave a lot to be desired in terms of the resources that are required to implement it. So would like the implementation to be proactive and demand-driven. We also think that, this is not what we think. This comes out of a research conducted in consultation with national authorities. And the national authorities believe that it should be also predictable. It should be based on structured programs that would enable full implementation of the convention. Results or outcome-oriented programming. Without achieving results, of course, we cannot hope to do anything. So this is one of the overarching principles of this national implementation programming. Multi-sectoral programming from meeting national objectives, because the implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention cuts across a number of state agencies, a number of actors, sectors across government. So it has to be multi-sectoral. And the design of this national implementation framework is also pretty much informed by activities in other international organizations. Other international organizations, they have country program frameworks, program development frameworks, etc. For example, before coming here, I worked for International Atomic Energy Agency. I was one of the officers in charge of the agency's Africa program. And the starting point for any intervention at national level is the development of country program document. Thankfully, here also at OPCW, there was a research that was started in 2007, completed in 2009, and concluded with the development of this national implementation framework, which we are trying to operationalize by doing strategic communication starting at our recent annual meeting of national authorities. The national implementation framework is to be used as a basis for comprehensive needs assessment. It should also be enable CWC implementation action plan. Philippines mentioned a national CBRN action plan. It's pretty much along that line, but this one focuses on CWC implementation. It could therefore be a subset of the CBRN national action plan. It's going to be an evolving document, highlighting key areas in need of support. and informing the design of the TC capacity building programs. There are a range of state implementers and stakeholders. National authorities are, of course, our entry pointers, but there are other stakeholders in ministries of defense, ministries of foreign affairs, ministries of finance and economy, ministries of health, environment, etc. All these stakeholders have to come together around the table and develop this national implementation framework to have a proactive country-led intervention. I'll briefly show you the processes that will be involved in developing this national implementation framework. The first one is context analysis. The situation analysis has to be undertaken by the national authority and stakeholders themselves. They have to do also what we call stakeholder analysis. We have tools for stakeholder analysis. Who does what, who has what responsibilities, and who should be doing what. These are some of the questions that must be answered in this regard. They have to then identify gaps and formulate priorities. And based on identification of gaps, identification of needs, demands, and then they have to design the national implementation action plan. In the interest of time, I'll keep it short and sweet, and I'll not speak about each one of these processes, which are very involved and detailed. This is a simplified action plan template we've proposed that came out of that exercise I mentioned earlier. Priority objective, actions to be taken, tasks to be completed to achieve the objective, responsible agency, partners, budget, time frame, and status. So it's not a complicated country program framework or similar documents as are used in other international organizations. We are planning to start simple and then move towards more rigorous strategic planning as we gather experience and also secure buy-in from involved state parties. Examples of obligations that could guide identification of analysis, guide identification and analysis, prioritization and planning of activities. We have identified this based on the request of state parties in developing countries. So there are a range of obligations that could be considered in designing the national implementation framework and the national action plan in a particular context. Again, I will not dwell on this slide. It's a very busy slide, and move on to the next one in the interest of time. Examples of obligations that could guide identification of analysis, identification, analysis, and prioritization and planning of activities. For example, managing chemical threats, adapt the measures to ensure that all toxic chemicals and their precursors are only used for non-prohibited purposes. Adopt, enforce penal sanctions applicable to natural and legal persons for undertaking any activity prohibited by the convention. I mean, this sound like preliminary, but there are countries, there are contexts in which these are pretty much relevant, because there are a number of countries in different parts of the world that have to have their legislations in place. So in terms of facilitating economic and technological development, there are a range of things that can be considered by state parties, relevant state parties. Examples of priority objectives. Again, we came up with these priority objectives based on situation analysis of state parties, also in consultation with them. So review the national authority structure and functioning and determine whether it is fit for purpose. There are national authorities who are one-person operations, and there are national authorities with elaborate structure, resources, etc., etc. So this is pretty much relevant. Assess national capacity in assistance and protection, and develop refined strategies and plans for every eventuality. This is about assistance and protection plans, and there are also contexts where this has to be done in a systematic, structured, and organized manner. So these are, again, identified, developed in the interest of assisting the development of the national implementation framework. Now, I'll end the discussion, the the talk on the national implementation framework and move on to program, specific activity which we are delivering to the Africa region in collaboration with funding support from the US government. I thank the US government for this support. It's a regional, a Pan-African conference on enforcing effective customs control over the trade in toxic chemicals in Africa. It will be organized, it will be hosted in the Republic of Congo, Brazzaville, which is in the Great Lakes region, and the dates of the conference are 23 to 25th of May this year. The hosts are the National Authority of Congo, which is part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Customs Administration, which is part of the Ministry of Finance and Economy. We have about 65 participants coming from Customs Administration and national authorities of 31 state parties. Resource persons involved, Senior Program Officer from OPCW, Head of Declaration Verification and Evaluation Unit from OPCW, Information and Intelligence Analyst, Compliance and Facilitation Directorate of the World Customs Organization, Strategic Trade Control and Enforcement Program Expert Trainer from World Customs Organization, and one regional expert from Ghana, who is Principal Scientific Officer at the Regional Customs Lab and who is also STCE Trainer. And we have also an expert from UN Security Council Resolution 1540 and also affiliated with United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Like I said, there are 31 state parties. I have listed those state parties for the benefit of those of you who come from that region. And the objective of this conference is to strengthen capacities to enforce effective control over the transfer of scheduled chemicals. It's a strategic communication exercise which aims to deepen understanding on the transfers regime of the convention. It aims to enhance awareness of region-specific threats pertaining to the acquisition and use of toxic chemicals by non-state actors, which has been pretty much the topic of the conversation this afternoon, and of related risks and vulnerabilities emanating from trans-border trade in chemicals, exchange pertinent experiences and good practices related to addressing threats arising from non-state actors, advance and enhance regional cooperation in relation to the implementation of CWC. And conference topics, the CWC, its verification region, the role of customs in fulfilling national obligations. As I said, this is a strategic communication exercise, and it's vitally important we touch upon this, the basics of the convention and what it entails in terms of national implementation. The threat posed by non-state actors regarding the illicit transfer of toxic chemicals, as well as the assessment and management of this threat. Risk analysis, risk assessment, risk management are all involved, and our WCO colleagues will be contributing to the conversation on these topics. Progress and challenges in implementing the transfer regime of scheduled chemicals under the CWC. There will be national presentations from different parts of Africa, from different regions, Southern Africa, Western Africa, Northern Africa, the Great Lakes region, and Eastern Africa, and they'll be discussing progress and challenges in implementing the convention, with emphasis on the import-export trade control in chemicals. Now, my last slide, the conclusion. The conference, which I have briefly described, and I'm happy to share more information about the event, will in the long run contribute to mitigating security threats in the region where state fragility, porous border, inadequate institutions remain major challenges. The conference builds on the results of the sub-regional workshop on the role of national implementing legislation in addressing threats from non-state actors, which was conducted in Dakar, Senegal last year in November. The conference is also in sync with the workshop on preventing illicit transfer of chemicals, a series of tailor-made workshops to be hosted at the Center for Chemistry and Technology, which aims to improve national capabilities to combat illicit chemical trade. This event is an example of well-scoped, targeted regional assistance that advances ICS capacity building effort and provides a template for regional and sub-regional engagement in cross-border control of illicit transfer of chemicals. I once again thank the US government for funding this initiative. Of course, more funds and expert support from some of the agencies who are sitting here would be most welcome. We will be very delighted to work with you and promote safety and security in Africa and other regions of the world where these are major issues. Thank you very much. That's
Open the floor now to questions or points of discussion, either to our colleagues from the FBI or from the technical secretariat and what they covered. We'll go a few and then have a round of discussion. Sweden first, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. I have a question for Mr. Bo. So you mentioned that the exchange that you've had internationally has been very helpful, and I think we would completely subscribe to your description of how important it is to have the methods vetted, to have the knowledge published and peer reviewed. So I was wondering if you see any role for the OPCW in this, and how we could sort of enhance the OPCW as a platform. Thank you.
Ambassador from South Africa, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chairperson. I've been listening very attentively to the various presentations, but I'll try not to ask too many questions. But perhaps just group a few questions under a theme. And I'll start with the Technical Secretariat. Maybe it's more of a comment than a question, which is that we seem to be focusing more on capacity building for national implementation. And very often capacity building simply means having warm bodies, not so much building capability to do what needs to be done. We seem to be satisfied with the fact that yes, there are warm bodies that are in place. Perhaps, yes, there is a national framework for implementation. Not so much whether, in fact, the people are being equipped with the capability to implement. There seems to be a need for that paradigm shift. But perhaps you have a different experience from what I'm hearing, from what the presentation says. And if that be so, I would be happy to be enlightened. With regard to, perhaps linked to this question, listening to the FBI presentation, which proceeds from the premise that the primary responsibility is to protect American citizens, I suppose wherever they may be in the world, not just in the United States. What I wonder about is whether there is any new thinking, perhaps, that may be developing that sees greater merit in a global effort to have international security against chemical weapons, rather than an insular approach that focuses on particular citizens wherever they may be in the world. Whether, in fact, what we should be doing is focusing on making sure that the world has in fact people with the capabilities to protect, to offer protection to everybody, not just American citizens, wherever they may be. And the expertise that the US may have could be, in a sense, brought into that kind of global effort to make sure that it's not just Americans whose security is being pursued, but everybody's security. And the more everybody is secure, the more Americans themselves will also be secure, wherever they may be in the world. And in a sense, that would probably offer greater security globally against chemical weapons. Perhaps my last question has to do with, and maybe it's a philosophical question. Which has to do with the fact that if you look at the United Nations, you have the General Assembly and the various other bodies. And over and above that, you then have the UN Security Council, being, call it, if you like, in a manner of speaking, the police of the United Nations. The OPCW does a lot of work. We generate reports, we test samples, and what we do is basically just generate information about whether chemical weapons were used or not. And of late, maybe since 2018, we're also able to go so far as to say who is responsible for it. But it does seem to me that perhaps the OPCW, perhaps this is, as I said, maybe it's a slightly controversial question. Maybe I shouldn't pursue it. But I'm very curious about, maybe let me just limit it to the two questions I've posed. I must be conscious of the fact that I'm chairperson of the CSP, so I can't raise too many controversial questions. Thank you.
I don't think you can ask too many questions, Ambassador. I wouldn't worry about that. If nobody else has any, but I'll give it back to the panel now. Perhaps I'll go left to right here, and Solomon, I'll give you the first mic.
Ambassador, thank you very much for that pertinent question. Yeah, it's you're right. Capacity building, capacity. In fact, in many other places, they don't even call it capacity building. They call it capacity development because it's not capacity. It's not a building. It's not brick by brick exercise. It's a process which starts by definition with resident capacities. So it's a complicated process. It starts, I mean, you can develop capacities at individual level, organizational level, and at what they call enabling environment level, the broader policy, legal, strategic framework, which allows certain things to happen. So it's correct that its capacity development is more than bigger than designing and delivering an event. The post-event engagement is vitally important. And that's why we are working with our state parties, with our national authorities, to encourage them to properly identify beneficiaries of capacity development activities we undertake. Once you do that, it means there is a potential for that person, for that beneficiary to come back to the country and share whatever knowledge, whatever skills, whatever other changes that he has gathered from attending the event to the benefit of his organization, to the benefit of his colleagues, etc., etc. In fact, we have started also in earnest working on the development of post-event action plans. So we hope that this will improve the situation. In terms of targeting, in terms of building capabilities, the needs assessment exercise, which is a very big part of this national implementation framework, would give us the necessary inputs, the necessary raw material to build on in terms of designing our programs, rolling out them, and doing monitoring and evaluation. But all this requires also resources, and as one of our decision makers, I would like to submit a plea so that this organization, this technical secretariat, remains well resourced and supported at all levels, so that the multi-pronged exercise of developing capacities can be effective, really effective, and deliver what it should deliver to our state parties. I'll stop there.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for that question.
But
Sorry.
perhaps before you do that, let me embellish my second question. Perhaps it's not misunderstood. I'm listening very carefully to the presentations that followed. I'm green with envy with what the US is able to do and the capabilities that it has. I'm just wondering whether, if those capabilities were shared, wouldn't we have a much safer world? Perhaps that's the context I wanted to paint in relation to the second question that I posed. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Certainly, it was purposeful in me actually putting the mission up there for the FBI, because it does come across as very myopic. But my intention of doing that is to show the FBI's scope in this engagement, and also to show that the FBI is a mere contributor, as a part of the U.S. government, a whole of government approach within the confines of our mission and our directed resources there. I acknowledge that the U.S. government's role and even responsibility to contribute in this arena to the world's protection against chemical weapons is necessary, and that's where I think some of my colleagues here, from a policy perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, and from other aspects of government, are looking at that. So I would say that, from my perspective, the U.S. government is invested in this beyond U.S. interests, and I'd invite some of my colleagues from State Department, from U.S. OPCW, and from DHS, et cetera, to talk about how they operate outside the confines of their mission. So my mission is I do have the authority and I do have the capability to work with foreign partners. However, I am confined, which is why we are but a mere component of this.
And just to add to that, the programmatic work that I described at the outset of our discussion that we conduct is capacity building, but designed to enhance our collective security precisely by sharing the types of knowledge and procedures that we have. And in fact, the FBI does participate oftenstimes in the work that we do. So we are sharing this broadly for the purpose of sharing that knowledge and enhancing our collective security, such that, and not to speak for the FBI, so that our foreign partners will be able to conduct the same types of investigations, so that we're able to ensure they have the knowledge and equipment and things like that. So we're conducting this type of training all the time, and I'm happy to elaborate a little bit further offline, Mr. Ambassador, if it'd be helpful. Thank you.
I'll jump in from the DHS perspective. So the Global Congress on Chemical Security and Emerging Threats is jointly co-implemented by ourselves, the FBI, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and Interpol, not just to have the U.S. perspective shared with the network, but for that regional cross-sector sharing amongst multiple partners. So we have 70 countries right now part of the Global Congress on the Global Congress. So all with the goal of countering chemical and explosive terrorism. So it is just, I'll admit, it is in the beginning stages. We started in 2018 and then had to, handle the lack of limited engagements due to the pandemic. But I think getting to that point of having our plenary sessions, our webinars and our activities really highlight the best practices, not just from a U.S. perspective to others, but what others are doing in the area of chemical security, how they're responding to and mitigating the threats. That is the end goal for that sharing across multi-sector and a multi-regional approach. And then also as well, happy to talk with you more offline about the Global Congress. We do have a lot of participation from the African continent, but I think we're absolutely interested in expanding and having a more diverse representation there in the coming years.
Okay, so I guess my turn. The question from Sweden as far as publications and OPCW, I think it is important for OPCW to encourage publications. I suspect OPCW has a similar problem that I do. I mean, we're an operational component of the US government. Most of my time is spent doing casework. So I don't have a lot of time to publish, but what I generally do is try and encourage publications by other folks that meet our needs and meet our requirements. And that may be a discussion that OPCW should have internally about how do you communicate your challenges to be able to encourage open publications in those areas. You don't want to teach people to make chemical warfare agents, but you sure as heck want to have the best tools to be able to identify them when they do come up. So I think that's the first thing. As far as the question about how we engage with the rest of the world, the FBI, as it's already been mentioned, we're a support in these roles. If anybody needs anything that I was talking about today, State Department or the legal attaches are the way to get to us. And it can be as simple as a consult associated with a capability, or it can actually be something a little more extensive if that's necessary. But we, I know over the years I've worked international cases as well. Sometimes we're pushing capability, and sometimes we're taking the sample and analyzing it for somebody and giving them the results, and potentially providing somebody in their court to be able to do the testimony for them as well.
Okay, I think the moment has come to close what's been a very interesting afternoon in discussion. First, I want to thank our panelists, many of whom have traveled many miles to be here. We appreciate very much your expertise, your openness, and your willingness to discuss these issues with participating states here at the OPCW. And I think it's been a very worthwhile afternoon. But also I want to thank all of the participants. I think that our idea here was to have an interactive session. This is not a one-off, it's part of a continuing conversation. And what I want to underline is that for the United States, the idea of enhancing international cooperation is not a rhetorical commitment. It is a practical, real commitment that we devote resources to, and we want to do better. And the only way we can do better is by hearing from you. So, and also when I say it's an ongoing conversation, I mean it, because I'm now happy to invite everybody for a cup of coffee outside where we can continue this talk. So thanks, everybody.